Corruption Watch released its annual report on corruption for 2020 today. Key areas where corrupt activity was identified was in the area of administration and procurement, which got a lot of airtime as we learned of shenanigans around PPE procurement last year. Corruption Watch says that it received the second highest tally of complaints in the calendar year, amounting to some 4,780 here in South Africa. In terms of the country's global standing, the 2020 Corruption Perceptions Index had South Africa unchanged at 44, now ranking 69th out of 180 countries. Well, to discuss the index further, I'm joined on the line by Kavisha Pillay, the head of stakeholder and campaigns at Corruption Watch. Thank you very much, Kavisha, for joining us. Before we get into the key findings here in South Africa, how is the country faring in the global context when it comes to corruption? What countries are we seemingly on par with?
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
Sure.
Every year there is the Transparency International Global Corruption Perceptions Index. And what seems to have happened over the last 10 years is that South Africa has remained fairly stagnant. And the key thing is to look at the score that we get out of 100 in comparison to a rating in terms of the rankings of a country.
Okay.
Because each year there's a new country that's added. So by just looking at the score, we have scored around the regions of 44 to 46 out of 100. And any country that scores below 50, which is actually the majority, the vast majority of the world, you know that those countries have a serious problem. So what we can draw from that is that, you know, there hasn't been much movement in South Africa in terms of improving our scoring in the CPI.
Yeah.
And, you know, over the next few years, we hope that with the various interventions, hopefully our scoring will improve.
Of course, last year didn't help matters. So because of the emergency procurement processes that kicked in last year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which dispensed with some of the regular checks and balances, a massive door was opened to corruption. And of course, much has been said about dodgy procurement deals, especially in relation to PPE. What were your findings in this regard?
Definitely. I mean, we saw the sector that we saw a very high number of reports coming with corruption related to COVID-19 issues. And whilst there was a significant number of reports, 16% of those reports related to procurement, what we did see, though, was other areas, there was an increase. There was a sort of significant number of reports coming in, particularly in relation to maladministration. So these are compliance issues. For example, relating to the temporary employment relief scheme, where employers weren't paying their employees, but also misappropriation of resources and resources, for example, in relation to theft of food parcels and so on. But procurement was definitely a huge issue. I think it's something that we have to keep monitoring. There was a lot of lessons that were learned last year. Certain provincial governments were disclosing their spend, and we saw, especially in Gauteng, there's a massive abuse. But even when moving out of the COVID period, government needs to be open in terms of procurement. They need to be implementing open contracting principles to make sure that we prevent this abuse in future.
What did you see in areas like education and, you know, other areas basically? The reason I'm focusing on education is because, you know, we heard about the fumigation of the classes when there were no students there, R500,000 or something, R500 million in Gauteng. You know, what sort of observations did you make there?
Definitely. Education popped up again as a hotspot for corruption, especially during the COVID period. So key hotspots were in policing. We received the highest number of reports relating to police corruption as well as corruption in the health sector. But yes, education did pop up, and, you know, issues relating to sanitizing, into who was getting tenders to do fumigation, in relation to feeding schemes, etc., that were set up to still assist vulnerable communities that weren't receiving food parcels. So the feeding schemes were set up through schools to assist those communities. That was also abused. And I think in these sectors, in policing and healthcare and in education, you know, as much as we sort of see the big billions and the sort of grand corruption, I think what our whistleblowers were telling us in these is it's often everyday petty bribery and abuse that takes place, but that has a significant impact on, you know, your right to, you know, fair education, your right to access to food, your right to decent healthcare, your right to sort of safety and dignity. And this is a sort of key area for us at Corruption Watch that we are increasingly becoming concerned about, is the manner in which corruption is starting to impede access to socio-economic rights. And, this was sort of being abused, or this was rampant even before COVID, but COVID has just, put it on a different level.
Yeah.
We're starting to see major increases in all of those sectors.
It's not that long ago that the head of, that the head of the MPA, Shamila Batoy, indicated that it could take quite a long time to prosecute those who are said to have been associated with state capture. I mean, when you hear a statement like that from somebody as eminent as that, who's supposed to be investigating these kind of cases, how does that make you feel? You guys serve a really important advocacy role. You put out these reports year in, year out, but it just doesn't seem to, take effect on the ground.
Definitely. I mean, I think we've been seeing this every day with, the whistleblowers, the most recent whistleblower at the state capture inquiry, Mr. Athol Williams, talking about the impact that corruption is having on whistleblowers where they can't access employment. So, and they're facing a lot of issues as well. On the one hand, it's not a good environment for whistleblowers, because they're seeing that actually people and perpetrators are not being held accountable, and that they're also in a very difficult environment. I think what we need to start doing is the way in which we've been responding to corruption has always been very reactive. So we wait for the corruption to happen,
yes,
and then are up in arms, and then we need to do an investigation, and then it doesn't always get prosecuted, and we don't really see people being locked up.
Yeah.
I think the main lesson that we can draw from this last, few years, I can guess, is that we need to put preventative measures in place. So we saw how, emergency procurement, or in a pandemic or in any type of situation, how procurement processes can be abused. And what we should be focusing on is, government, what are you doing now to prevent this wastage of money? What are you doing to close these loopholes? How can advocacy organizations like Corruption Watch, how can the media like yourselves, how do we put pressure to make sure that we close these loopholes? Because frankly, it's just tiring. The story doesn't, it's day in and day out of the same thing. And we need to start changing this narrative right now. And the way in which we can do that is identify areas for prevention, so that we're not always on the back foot, that we constantly have to react when, there's another big scandal.
Indeed. Kavisha Pillay, Head of Stakeholder and Campaigns at Corruption Watch, thank you so much for your time.